Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my good friend, a member of the Budget Committee, for yielding, and my colleague on the Rules Committee. And I rise to oppose the rule and oppose the underlying legislation. Now, I oppose the rule because it's not really a rule at all. It's really legislation masking as a rule. Buried in this rule is a measure that we call self-execute, but deem what the budget's going to be. In other words, our friends are telling us we may not have the votes, even though we have a substantial majority, to pass our own caps bill, but just in case, the rule vote, which is a partisan vote, and everybody, we're going to put it in here. Now, that doesn't speak of a high degree of confidence that my friends will have the votes, which they should have on their caps deal. And I would argue that it's technically legal, but it's not a very seemly practice to actually express your distrust of your own majority that directly. Second, let's talk a little bit about the underlying legislation. There's a lot here I don't agree with, but I want to focus on one thing in particular, Mr. Speaker, and that's the budget, quote unquote, itself, because it's not a budget. It's a caps bill. It's not even a caps deal. It hasn't been negotiated with the Senate, hasn't been negotiated with the administration. It's an arbitrary number. It has no chance of becoming law. There's no way a Republican Senate will have double the amount of increasing for domestic programs than it has for defense. Just not going to happen. So now the Appropriations Committee, and I'm always happy to have numbers as an appropriator, will now move on down with a set of numbers that we know will not survive negotiation with the Senate or with the President. So we're going to mark up a lot of bills, but they're going to be the numbers that are a fantasy. Finally, in this caps deal, we ought to point out our own rules require the majority to present a budget. We couldn't even get a budget out of the Democratic Budget Committee. Now, that is a failure to govern. The Speaker herself said on one occasion, "Show me your budget and I'll show you your values." Suggests that you don't want to show the American people your values because you certainly aren't showing us a budget in this legislation. So the rule, frankly, is a backdoor way to enact some sort of caps legislation that will not be accepted by the Senate, that will not be accepted by the President of the United States. The underlying legislation doesn't have a budget, which our own rules require that it has. It has a mere statement of spending levels that, again, are not going to be accepted by the other chamber or by the President of the United States. And finally, our friends have abdicated their most important responsibility, which is showing the American people their view and their vision of how the budget ought to shape. So the rule ought to be rejected, the underlying legislation ought to be rejected, and our friends ought to challenge themselves to bring us a budget that they can support, that they can put in front of the American people. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.